She waited for her chance. It came on a night when the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, masking every creak of the floorboards. He had gone to the shed, carrying a lantern, muttering about fixing something before the morning. She knew she had minutes, maybe less. Barefoot, she slipped from the bed and moved through the hallway, her heart pounding loud enough she was sure it would give her away. At the top of the stairs, she paused. The cellar door was there, the cabinet still pulled slightly from the wall since the last time she had looked. She hadn't planned to go near it again, but something in her, something deep, needed to see. The latch gave way with a tired groan, and the cold breath of the earth below rose to meet her. She descended slowly, her hand trailing the rough wall for balance. The candlelight from above barely reached the bottom, but she could see the shelves again, the jars, and behind them, something she hadn't noticed before. A large trunk sat in the far corner, its wood warped, its brass lock tarnished green. She knelt, her fingers brushing the surface, and found it unlatched. Inside were bundles of clothing, tiny dresses, shoes that could fit in the palm of her hand. Beneath them, more photographs. Each one showed a girl, standing stiff beside him, the same crooked smile on his face. Some of the faces looked like hers, others looked like they could be her sister, or her daughter. Her stomach churned and she stumbled back, knocking against a shelf. One jar tipped, crashing to the ground, spilling its contents in a wet, heavy thud. The shape that rolled free wasn't just familiar, it was undeniable. She didn't scream. She couldn't. The air seemed to close around her as she backed up the stairs, forcing the cabinet shut behind her. She didn't hear the shed door slam, but she heard his boots on the porch. He was home. That night, she lay, still in the bed, her eyes open, listening to his breathing beside her. She knew now there were others before her, and if she stayed, she would join them, not in life, but in the jars, preserved forever as part of his bloodline. The wind outside roared like it wanted to tear the house apart, and in her mind, she prayed it would. The first time she felt sick, she thought it was the water. The pump-out back had a metallic tang to it, and sometimes what came from it was more brown than clear. But the sickness didn't pass. It settled into her slowly, with waves of exhaustion that made her limbs heavy and her head swim. When she told him, his reaction wasn't concern, it was pride. His mouth curled into a grin that made her stomach twist tighter. "Good," he said, as if she had accomplished something. That night the news traveled fast. She woke to the sound of footsteps in the yard, shadows moving past the window, the low murmur of voices outside. His relatives had come, not to help, but to see. They gathered in the kitchen the next morning, their pale faces turned toward her, eyes fixed on the swell that would come. Someone brought out an old, stained quilt and draped it over her shoulders like it was some kind of coronation. She sat frozen in the chair, feeling the weight of their stares pressing into her skin. No one spoke of doctors. No one spoke of pain. They spoke only of continuing the line and keeping it pure. Weeks passed in a haze. She rarely left her bed, except when he insisted she sit with the family. The air in the house felt thicker now, and the whispers followed her from room to room. Sometimes they came from living mouths, other times from corners where no one stood. She began to dream of the cellar, of jars that moved, eyes that opened in the dark, small hands pressing against the glass. She tried to tell herself it was fever, that the nightmares weren't real, but one night, when she woke gasping, she saw him standing over her, holding something in his hands. A small, yellowed photograph. The girl in the picture was younger than her, but the eyes were the same. She recognized the dress. It hung in the back of the wardrobe, smelling faintly of mildew. "This was your mama," he said quietly. "She did her duty. You will too." The photograph shook in his hands, but not from fear, from excitement. And for the first time since she'd been brought to that house, she knew if she didn't leave soon, she would never leave at all. Spring brought a false sense of relief. The snow melted, the mud roads opened again, and sunlight spilled into the rooms for the first time in months. But for her, The light only exposed the cracks, both in the house and in the people who inhabited it. He started taking her into town more often, but never alone. Always at his side, his hand gripping her arm like a warning. She began to notice the way others looked at them. Not with surprise, no, they already knew, but with a kind of uneasy pity, as if they were watching something they couldn't stop but also couldn't bear to look away from. It was during one of these trips that she overheard the truth. Two older women stood near the back of the general store, their voices hushed but urgent. They didn't see her at first, tucked between shelves of flour and sugar. One said, "That poor girl's just a breeder now." The other shook her head, replying, "Like her mama before her, and her mama before that." The words burned into her, sharper than any slap. She wasn't just his wife. She was a link in a chain, one forged generations ago, tightened with every birth, every marriage arranged within the bloodline, and now she was expected to carry it forward. Back at the house, the visits from his relatives grew more frequent. Some brought gifts, a jar of preserves, a hand-sewn dress. Others just sat in silence, staring at her with the same slow, unblinking eyes she'd come to recognize in the photographs. More than once, she woke at night to the sound of voices in the hallway outside her room. Not talking about her, talking to her, whispering in words she couldn't quite understand, words that made the air colder and her skin prickle. "If you're still watching," the narrator's voice lowers here, heavy with weight, "you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline?" Her thought. Ez returned again and again to the cellar, to those jars, to what might happen to her if she stayed. But leaving wasn't simple. Out here, there were no buses, no trains, no one to run to who wasn't part of the same web, and every time she thought she might try, she saw the look in his eyes, calm but certain, the look of a man who knew she had nowhere else to go. What she didn't know then was that the bloodline had already taken hold of her in ways she couldn't yet feel, but soon would. Winter came early that year, pressing ice into the cracks of the old house and curling frost around the window frames. The cold made the air even heavier, trapping the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic that she could never quite place. He grew quieter in the winter, but his eyes followed her everywhere, across the room, down the hallway, through the narrow kitchen where the floor sloped toward the back door. It was during one of those long, silent evenings that she first saw the cellar door. She hadn't noticed it before, hidden behind a warped cabinet in the corner of the kitchen. The cabinet didn't quite sit flush against the wall, leaving a narrow gap, and through it she caught sight of a rusted iron latch. When she asked about it, he didn't answer, just looked at her for a long time, his lips pressed tight, before telling her to mind her own business. But she couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, when he went out to the shed, she pushed the cabinet aside, wincing as it scraped across the floor. The latch was stiff, but it opened with a sharp snap. The smell that poured out was like nothing she had ever known. Damp earth, rot, and something older, something that clung to her throat and made her eyes water. The steps were steep, carved from wood so dark it looked black. She didn't go far, just far enough to see the shelves lining the walls, jars filled with cloudy liquid. Inside them, shapes, small shapes. She thought they were animals at first, but some were too human to mistake. Tiny faces pressed against glass, their features disturbingly familiar. Her stomach turned, and she stumbled back up into the light. She shoved the cabinet into place just as the back door creaked open. He was home, his boots wet with snow, his gaze flicking instantly to her. He didn't ask where she'd been. He didn't have to. That night, he didn't speak a word to her. But she woke to find the cellar key hanging from a nail outside their bedroom door. Gone. And in the days that followed, she began to understand. The cellar wasn't just storage, it was history. This family's history, preserved, pickled, and hidden where only they could see it. It started with the photographs. She couldn't stop looking at them, those stiff portraits nailed into every wall. The faces never smiled, their eyes dull and unblinking even through the haze of fading ink. Some of them looked as if they could be the same person taken at different ages, but she learned they weren't. These were brothers marrying sisters, cousins marrying cousins, children born with the same twisted features and the same hollow stares. One night, when he had fallen asleep downstairs in his chair, she crept into the hallway with a candle. She traced her fingers over the frames, whispering the names carved into the wood beneath each image. Many were repeated, first names used over and over, as if the family tree had run out of branches and started folding back in on itself. The more she looked, the more she began to see them around town. A man at the feed store with the same drooping eyelids and forward-thrust jaw. A woman at church whose voice carried the same thick, slurred consonants. They all shared something in the way they moved, in the shape of their hands, in the slight sway of their heads when they spoke. It was like the whole family was one long echo of the same original people, and she was now a part of it. Sometimes when his relatives visited, they would talk in low voices, just out of her hearing, but she caught fragments, words like continuing the line and stronger blood. There was an unspoken expectation, one she didn't dare name aloud, but could feel tightening around her every day. The isolation was suffocating. The house groaned in the wind, the trees pressed against the windows, and the nights were darker than anything she had known before. In that darkness, she began to hear things, slow footsteps in the hallway when he was asleep beside her, a door clicking shut downstairs, faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. When she asked him about it, his answer was simple and cold. "It's just family." That was when she realized. This house didn't belong to him alone, it belonged to all of them, even the ones who weren't living anymore. And in a place like this, the dead were never really gone. The wedding was only the beginning. In this town, the ceremony wasn't a celebration, it was a binding. Once the preacher said the final words, she didn't go back to her mother's home. She followed him, barefoot down a dirt road, to a house that sat alone at the edge of the woods. It was the kind of house you didn't notice until you were standing in front of it. The paint had long peeled away, exposing grey wood beneath, warped by decades of rain and heat. The porch sagged in the middle, and the front door tilted on its hinges. There were no curtains, just sheets tacked over the windows from the inside. Inside smelled like damp wood and something sour, a scent that clung to her clothes for days. The floor creaked under her light steps, but when he walked, the boards groaned like they were warning her. Every wall was lined with pictures, faded photographs of pale faces with sunken eyes and identical features. It didn't take long for her to notice that many of them looked alike, too alike. He showed her to a room upstairs. There was no lock. The bed was small and low to the ground, covered with a quilt that had been patched and repatched so many times it looked more like a map than a blanket. She sat on the edge of it, clutching her hands together, listening to him move about the house below. Days turned into weeks. She didn't leave the property. He didn't let her. There was no school, no friends, no one to talk to except him, and sometimes his relatives who came by in silence, looking her over with an unsettling familiarity. Some were his cousins, others were also his siblings. She was never quite sure which was which. When he spoke, it was often about family, about how outsiders ruin blood, about how people like us have to keep the line pure. He talked about it the way others talk about religion, like it was sacred, unquestionable, and when he touched her, there was no tenderness, only possession. The neighbors, those few who lived near enough to suspect, never asked questions. In places like this, silence was safety, and for her, silence became survival. But as the seasons changed, she began to notice things, small things, that told her this family's darkness went much deeper than she had been told. She was 12 years old, a child in every way except for the way the law saw her. On the day they married her to him, the church was nearly empty. No flowers, no music, just the sound of old wooden pews creaking under the weight of the few who dared to attend. They all knew who he was, and what he was. He was 38. His face carried the kind of deformities that don't just happen by chance, a jaw that jutted forward unnaturally, one eye wandering as if it refused to look at the same world as the other. His speech was thick, wet, words dragging themselves out like they were reluctant to be heard. People whispered about his family, how they'd been marrying their own for longer than anyone could remember, but no one said it out loud, not in public, not in front of him. When she stood beside him, in a dress too long for her small frame, her hands disappeared inside the sleeves. Her hair was brushed back in a way that made her look older, but her eyes betrayed her age. Wide, unsteady, looking anywhere but at the man who would now own her. The preacher's voice was slow, deliberate, as if reciting a sentence rather than a blessing. Outside, the wind pressed against the old wooden door, rattling it like it was trying to get in. Inside, no one smiled. The air was heavy, thick with the knowledge that what was happening wasn't love. It was inheritance. In this place, in this forgotten corner of America, bloodlines were guarded the way others guarded land or money. Outsiders were threats. Marriage was not about choice, it was about preservation, and inbreeding wasn't a mistake here. It was a tradition. When he reached for her hand, she flinched. It was small, almost imperceptible, but enough for one woman in the back to lower her gaze, unable to watch. The ring slid onto her finger like a shackle. Somewhere in the back, a baby cried. The sound echoed off the wadi, and for a moment, it was the only thing that sounded alive in that room. What happened after that day is the part the family tried to bury, and they almost succeeded. Until now.